Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gottfried Hagen. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the first lecture this academic year, organized by the Center for Armenian Studies. Before I take the pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to point out some more upcoming events in the course of the semester. First of all, please watch out for the public screening of the award-winning movie Aurora Sunrise that will be in the State Theater on State Street starting September 29th. We will have one of the grand dynamic names of Armenian studies in the country, Sebuh Aslanian, presenting his new book on early modernity, the Armenian printing revolution, and imagining the confessionalization, coming on Wednesday, October 11th. There will be the 11th iteration of the workshop of Armenian and Turkish scholarship that has been a sort of long-standing series internationally, organized by Ron Sunny and our colleague Mugar on November 10th and 11th. And finally, in early December, to be specific, on December 6th, we'll have Gerard Liberidian, formerly holder of the chair in Armenian history here at U of M, to present his book, well, and it's not a precarious nation, it's a precarious republic. When does the future look like the past? So Wednesday, December 6th. And please stop by our website for the details of all these events. We're looking forward to seeing you there. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Elyse Semerdjian, who recently became the Robert Aram and Marian Kaloosdian and Stephen and Marian Mugar Chair of Armenian Genocide Studies at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. Well, that's 2.5 lines. Congratulations. So many of us know Elyse as a professor at Whitman College, where she has been for good 20 years. She obtained her PhD from Georgetown as a social historian of the Ottoman Empire, and her early work was on Armenians in the social fabric of Ottoman Aleppo. Her work, especially on Armenian and women's access to the bathhouses of Aleppo, is probably one of the most cited articles in Ottoman social history, because it hits so many buttons. It has really become such a classic, I want to say. However, what she's going to talk to us about today is something entirely different. She has turned to the memory and the memorialization of the Armenian Genocide. Her new book, Remnants, has just come out a few weeks ago from Stanford University Press. And I will admit I have not had a chance to look at the book precisely, but I have looked at some of her articles sort of building up to that work, which were really exciting in the way she has been sort of taking a new and fresh look at the memory, and how the memory of the pain and of the atrocities of the suffering have been sort of inscribed and carried on the human body in a way that is both, let's say, novel and historically rigorous and enlightening, but also makes a fascinating effort to not let the analytical sort of efface strictly human aspects of it. And so, on that note, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Please join me in welcoming Elyse Semerdjian.
I put a microphone on here. Can you hear me? Thank you. I think I'll just hold it. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Godfried, for that lovely introduction. It's remarkable to be here. This was a place that was very formative to me as a master's student, actually, in the interdisciplinary program, the Center for Middle East and North African Studies, as it was called at the time. Being here and taking courses from from actually three people, Kevork Bardakjian, Mugar Gocek, and Ronald Sunni, were really formative to me as an intellectual and sent me on a path that I don't think I could have ever anticipated would result in, becoming the chair at Clark, and all of this is very new to me. But what it did do is gave me a sense of thinking very critically about power from the outset. And so it's an honor to be here. And I would also say, although I will be missing the Watts conference, Watts has been very empowering to Ottoman scholars and Armenian studies scholars alike, has allowed us to push the envelope in ways that I don't even think we could have imagined 30 years ago when I was walking here on campus. I know I am that old. So I thank you for paving the way and also creating space where we could think critically about Ottoman studies and Armenian studies to get to a place where I hope to introduce you to where I'm thinking today. So thank you for having me here. I'm going to introduce you to Remnants, Embodied Archives of the Armenian Genocide, which explores how gender in the body figured centrally in the minds of not only perpetrators, but also humanitarians who set out to rescue and recuperate Armenian victims. The through line of the book examines post-memory of the Armenian Genocide and how the uprooting of the Ottoman Armenian community from their ancestral homelands in Anatolia, Turkey, is remembered as body horror, the memory of dismemberment, tattooed skin, and the bones of martyrs. So let's see if I can make the slide work good. So Remnants analyzes fragmentary evidence of Armenian survivors, paying special attention to the traces that violence has left on the body of the archive and on the actual bodies of Armenian victims and their descendants. The embodied trauma of victims of sexual abuse and forced marriage at times has been deemed too personal and too emotional to be worthy of historical study. I wish I were exaggerating, but actually even a recently published article in my field has noted that women's testimony shouldn't be used. It's too far removed from the actual incident, or at times we have this debate about whether it's too emotionally weighty to be worthy, in the sense that the Ottoman archives have become really the central battleground in which these debates have happened. And in part, I'm saying we need to open up ourselves to new archives, new forms of evidence. And so in this sense, I argue that the embodied trauma of victims of sexual abuse, should be used as historical evidence and I do this through an engagement in a number of interdisciplinary fields while reading memoirs, letters, newspapers, biographies, oral histories, ethnography, a lot of photography you'll see today, and also film, which I apologize, I'm not showing you film, but I can talk about it for you. And these films and sources are found in a dozen archives in 7 different languages. And so some of my travels took me to places like Denmark, where I never thought I would go to Copenhagen in my life. And yet the Danish missionaries were so important to the recovery of Armenians, and especially in Aleppo. Stories of sexual violence, while central to the objectives of genocide, are often relegated to a single page mention, with an existing historiography, even though women constituted the majority of victims, as the population was intentionally feminized through the elimination of men from the outset. And so I'm taking issue with how we can have like a sort of a large tome on Armenian genocide history, but give such little space to women and to the question of sexual violence. And so by highlighting these ciphered bits of information, or what I call remnants, I situate the material body of survivors as a repository of traumatic experience, bodies that also form sites of resistance where memory of victims are preserved by their descendants in embodied rituals and post-memory practices. And so I want to offer a definition here of post-memory, because my touchstone is really Holocaust post-memory, thinking about Marianne Hirsch and Leo Spitzer in this quotation. When they write, these events were transmitted to them so deeply and effectively so as to seem to constitute memories in their own right. Post-memory's connection to the past is thus mediated, not by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation. And here, the central passage for me is how a post-memory can feel as though it is a first-person memory. It captures some of the ways in which I'm taking post-memory and actually translating it into the term prosthetic memory, which I've borrowed from a few scholars and adapted to my study. I'm thinking about prosthetic memory in three respects: the memory of dismemberment, the memory of tattooed skin, and memorial practices that take place with bones in the unmarked killing fields of Deir ez-Zor, Syria. And so artists, scholars, and pilgrims have documented and performed creative rituals in the killing fields of the Syrian desert. And such memories, prosthetic memory that is, can be tied to pre-modern rituals, thinking about Christian practices of fasting, the Eucharist, self-flagellation, the Vespers, and pilgrimage, which itself is also an embodied practice. I'm thinking about a friend who's about to take the trip on the Camino in Spain, and she's going to walk for over 30 days on pilgrimage. So pilgrimage is also like a very embodied and arduous act, and that's taking place in Deir ez-Zor as well. And so I'm focusing on these memories of body horror that continue to haunt the Armenian community as an open wound. They are the subject of these memorial practices and post-memory works. And I also see them as a space of radical possibility for Armenians who are trying to make sense out of the senseless act of genocide. In pilgrimage in this work, when I think about the third part of the book, which will be about Deir ez-Zor, I think of pilgrimage also in a very secular way, not in a much more capacious way than the religious aspect. And you can push back against that, but I've had some pushback, but I'm saying pilgrimage in the sense that people are creating even rituals of their own creation, what I call these vernacular rituals, in order to simulate some kind of ceremony among the bones in the desert. And so I wanted to mention probably the most important post-memory work, which I do engage for some length in the book, is Suzanne Khardalian's grandma's tattoos, which has in part inspired this work. I wanted to investigate the history and the deeper context to the tattoos after seeing this film, which aired on Al Jazeera in 2011. And this is a still from the film in which she interviews her Aunt Lucia and talks to her Aunt Lucia about her tattoos. But there's a really, I think, a productive friction in the film itself that we can see the filmmaker has a very different conceptualization of what the tattoos mean than the Tantique Lucia in Hollywood, who has her own ideas about the tattoos. And it's that friction that prompted me to think also about the loquaciousness of tattoos, how tattoos have this capability to communicate in multiple registers, different meanings across communities. And so I realize the tattoos are a tricky topic and that they mean different things to different communities. So I hope that you'll get a taste of that complexity in the lecture today, because I do want to push back also against how some Armenians have interpreted them and only through one single lens. I do something also very different in the book, which is talk about my own family history. Now, I call this disciplinary heresy because historians are trained in what Hayden White has called the middle voice. We're to talk in this third person omniscient voice. And I push back against it, mostly after reading a lot out of my discipline, to also think of it as kind of a feminist intervention, to say, I have a subjectivity, I have my embodied knowledge or lack thereof of myself, because what I mostly talk about is how I know very little about my own family. And this is my family. This is my grandmother, Haripsame, just on the eve before the genocide. And I found myself reading the League of Nations records, looking for her inside them, and I didn't find her. Trying to find evidence of my own family, because there was very little talk about the genocide and what happened and how they survived. And so I was very much relying on the memory of relatives to fill in gaps that weren't shared with me. It's common for traumatized genocide survivors to not speak of the past. I'm thinking of Harry Haratunian's memoir called The Unspoken as Heritage. We inherit the silence. So I inherited silence, but what I learned in the process was that my great-grandfather Hagop, he would be my great-great-grandfather Hagop here, was a tailor for the Ottoman military. He sold the uniforms for the Ottoman soldiers, and that was part of how they were able to survive. And there's actual family memories that the family was about to be deported until everyone realized, oh, that's the tailor, we can't deport his family. So they were able to stave off deportation for some years as a result of this complicity. And at the same time, they ultimately became victims, and we did lose members of our family. But aside from that, I know very little, and I wanted to disclose this personal history in order, to be transparent and take cues from a sister discipline of anthropology and sociology, where this type of practice is a form of important critical disclosure to note that I am not completely separated from my topic of study. Now, this is a chronology that I think a lot of people in this room are familiar with, but I felt, history is the study of contexts, so I felt compelled to offer a timeline. But what I would like to offer is how I'm thinking about this timeline through the lens of embodiment, and that would be, thinking about 1915 and the forced conscription and disappearance of Armenian men as an intentional feminization of the population. And you could say, okay, there's boy children, but I argue that these are not yet gendered bodies, prepubescent, or even for the Ottoman state, we know like earlier than 5 years old was also a kind of fungible body that could be transformed into, a Muslim Turk or perhaps, Muslim Kurd. So the idea that age mattered in terms of gender and that they're intersectional that way, and that the disappearance of men made the rest of the population more vulnerable, especially as it include disarmament. I was thinking of Ronald Sunni's term that April 24th, 1915, the arrest orders for the Armenian intellectuals, he's called it in the past the decapitation of the Armenian community. I thought that was an important kind of body metaphor as well to think about the process. Although we also know that it wasn't just those 250 or so Armenian elites who were able to organize the community on the ground. There will be simultaneous organization of the Armenians to save and rescue themselves, the topic of Khachik Moradian's recent book. But what we have also is the dispersion and dismemberment, and thinking about the communal body and the dismemberment of the communal body, which includes, attacking individual bodies with very precise sexual atrocities. Catherine McKinnon has argued that this is a form of communication between men. Just being University of Michigan, I have to call out to her in her work on gender and genocide, because, understanding why sexual atrocities actually look so similar across different genocides, it's because sexual atrocity is a kind of articulation and communication between men that I can do this to you and your community. I can get away with this. And then dispersion and dismemberment also means that during the relocation and resettlement law, when we have the actual deportation, some people actually didn't even leave their villages or their communities. So, the first two chapters of the book, which I will not be talking about today, analyzes, for example, some ways that people were killed and where they were killed. When a man is killed on the threshold of his home, that is not incidental. That is by design, right? And then during the course of the genocide, when we had these deportations, Grigory Spalakian used this term body snatching to talk about a kind of looting of the body. And so I analyzed various instances of that, which includes actually stripping the body of clothing. Remarkably, so many survivors talked about marching naked. It's not an incidental metaphor that you might find maybe in an Armenian lamentation, like, Derzor Cholaranda. It actually talks about the naked Armenian in the desert, right? No, it's by design. The stripping of the body is actually the removal of identity, thinking about the clothing that actually affirmed locality, class, gender, positionality. And so I think of body snatching also as a way of also the abductions along the caravan route, which included, abduction of women and children, forced conversion, marriage, concubinage, slavery, domestic labor. And I have a long chain of various kinds of practices because no two cases are the same. Although there are patterns, there are also huge differentiations. And so I don't mean to take one woman's story and say it's every woman's story, but to look at the stories together. There are some common patterns, but there are also remarkable differences. And then finally, I see what I want to talk about mostly today is the rescue and recuperation efforts, kind of moving beyond the more graphic parts of the book, which I do, warn the reader about reading. But the rescue and recuperation efforts were also very much focused on recovering bodies, recuperating bodies. And so that also has an important story to tell. And those practices are undertaken by Armenians. They're undertaken by American and European relief. And we have great documentation of that. So my general framework is actually through the lens of gender and genocide studies, which is a really emerging and a robust field that's really taken off in light of the gendered aspects of genocide in Bosnia and Rwanda, especially after the pivotal Rwanda case in 2008 that found rape as a tool of genocide. We can now start talking about genocide as a manifestation of patriarchy that actually targets patriarchal relations to unravel the social fabric that is, the social fabric that is the Armenian community. I would focus on, maybe Elyse van Hoden-Forgery, who talks about how genocide actually targets the womb and targets reproduction in very specific ways. She calls it life force atrocity. If you understand it in that way, you can understand how bodies are appropriated, how wombs are targeted, how reproductive parts are targeted in genocide. And so I wanted to give you a map for some context. Again, I think many people in this room probably know this map, but I do focus quite a bit on on Syria, but thinking about the deportations as heading in the direction of Aleppo and then east towards Deir Zor. And here I have a map of some of the areas where the rituals took place that I documented with some oral histories and oral interviews with Armenians who traveled there, but also with documents because there's copious amounts of Armenian writing, about Deir Zor. It lingers and weighs heavily in the post memory of Armenians or prosthetic memory. Let's see if I can make this go. So the book is in 3 parts. The body, I'm going to talk mostly about the recovery and recuperation. I'm not here to further traumatize you. I actually do hope that somehow at the end you will feel some, kind of hope about the type of memory work that's happening in the Armenian community. And then I'll move to skin, and it includes kind of talking about tattoos. I could have talked about skin in many different respects, thinking about wounds and disease. There's many ways to approach it, but I focused mostly on tattoos. And then finally, bones and the remains of martyrs and how those are ceremonialized by Armenians, mostly from the MENA region, mostly from Lebanon and Syria, but it has, over the last decade and a half, included more Americans, including Peter Balakian, who's documented his journeys. So let's start with bodies. And I wanted to show you what I'm writing against. I think, there are many people who are using the Ottoman documents in order to, why is this not working? Yeah, I think this isn't working well enough. There are many Ottoman documents. For example, at war's end, the armistice by treaty, Armenians inside Muslim households, whether Turkish, Kurdish, or Arab, were to be released by treaty and handed back over to the Armenian community. And so by 1919, we actually have Armenians who are seeking to recover their loved ones. And sometimes they actually use the official Ottoman governance system to try to recover these bodies. And this is not particular to my study. We do have studies of this where, in this case, we actually have documentation of a woman who was abducted from the deportation line. So I wanted to give you an idea of what you could say kind of a paper trail looks like of some of these women from the Ottoman perspective. Here, this document from Sivas says it's understood from the complaint that Gendarme Company captain, Niyazi Effendi, took an Armenian girl as a bride for himself by force during the relocation. So it's basically a bride taken by force from the deportation line. And that the Armenian girl, not being content with the above mentioned person, nowadays wishes to go to her mother's household despite not daring to do so. So we have a registration of her will, her desire to leave, and there's no resolution to this matter. Many of these documents, we don't see resolutions, or we often see negative resolutions where the family is not able to recover the woman or girl in question. But there is an attempt to use the Ottoman legal system, to use the Ottoman governance system to recover these girls. In one case, there are some Armenian men who actually know that a girl is inside, and they actually try to take the girl by force. They knock on the door, and when the man opens, they punch him in the nose and try to take her by force to kind of mirror back the abduction that had happened, like kind of a reverse image of the genocide. But as you might know, like I'm not going to dwell on the Armenian documentation in the Ottoman courts, because I don't really feel like it's the most productive. I wanted to try to get to the voices of Armenians. And so here's an example, and of Rupan Herian, who was actually in New York City, and he was driven by like witnessing through the media what was happening in the Ottoman Empire to his community. So he went back. And he enlisted with the French Foreign Legion, but they rejected him because he was 50 years old. They said he was too old. And so what he did is he created a one-man rescue effort. And I do want to say I learned about him through Anna Alexanian, a Clark graduate, who wrote about him. But what he has is this giant cache of documents in Yerevan. And he also published frequently in the press. He went to Deir Zor, and he, within about 2 to 3 years, rescued nearly 2,000 Armenians, mostly on his own with some assistance from the Armenian church in Aleppo, the Prelacy. And he wrote about how it was challenging to get these Armenian women, especially, to exit the home. So that's what this essay is about. And he wrote, some of them, the women, which are very few, get used to the life in the harems and they want to stay there. Others do not know that in the world there has been revolution and change. Some have children that they don't want to part from. Some think that there are no Armenians left in the world. They've seen such devastation, they don't actually believe Armenians survived it in any way. So they stay in the Muslim households they've been absorbed in. They think that if they leave their husbands who gave them dry bread, chorhats, and help them stay alive, that they will once again become helpless and homeless and die. And so what we have here, in Karen Yape, the Danish missionary, humanitarian who worked in Aleppo, she also wrote about some of the challenges of extracting women, especially after they have children. It becomes very challenging. Rupan Herian had his own methodology, which was often to take money he got from North America, from Europe, translate it into gold, and buy the women back again. So a lot of women will talk about being bought and sold in slave auctions that emerged during the genocide. One child might say, I was sold for 2 sheep, or one woman said I was sold for 2 bags of wheat during the genocide. He was buying them back with gold. And he was doing it in a way like dressing as a Bedouin, which is quite fascinating, and coming up to the families in his broken Arabic and saying, thank you so much for everything you've done to save this child. I'm here to thank you and offer you this gift. May I take the child and offer you this gold? And so using kind of customary gift giving as a technique to release the children and women was something he did. And this is the real gem as well, also from his stash. He saved all the letters, notes that he made to himself. And Sosi Mishoyan here actually helped me with these letters. They are written they're very difficult, and I could not have done this without her, because these letters are quite remarkable, but they are written hastily. This is a letter from a captive Armenian woman. Her condition is not clear. We know she's living with an Arab in Raqqa, and in between Aleppo and Deir Zor. And she writes her father, "Dear father, I was very happy to receive your letter. Praise the Lord through his infinite favor. He rescued us from our enemies. Father, when I was made aware that you were alive, I felt so happy. I wish I had the wings of a bird to fly and come to you." So poetic. And then She says, Father, I have two children here. One is Nazareth and the other from the Arab. So she has her child from the previous marriage, which is great because we know some women were not able to keep their children or lost them in the deportations. And she said, when I received your letter, I wanted to come to Aleppo. They have been corresponding with each other. And she is not in an environment where you would necessarily think that. And I think there's a untold story about how these communications were being facilitated by other Armenians clandestinely, and also by, I think the unsung heroes are the muleteers, the mule riding boys, because the mule riding boys are riding from village to village, transporting bodies and people and letters. It's quite remarkable. And so she says, I beg my father to free me from this Arab. The Arab is unnamed. Go to the church and beg, talking about the Armenian prelacy in Aleppo. Go and beg that they help release her. I remain your beloved daughter, Kaloosdian. So here is like a voice from beyond the grave. It is not dated. And we also don't have an inscription on the envelope or on the backside to tell us whether she was released. So remnants are messy and unresolved. We don't get a complete narrative, but we get these small fragments that hopefully, through some massaging, we can get a little bit more of the story than we had before about these type of women and children. I'm going to move to skin. And I had a lot of questions about skin, and they're not the questions that I'd seen answered in Grandma's tattoos. Although I did interview Suzanne Khardalian, and she is a fascinating person, especially about her impressions of Der Zor, but also other aspects that she knew that did not make their way into the film. So it almost feels like she has a part two to say more than what she was able to in such a short format. But my questions are, how did the tattooed skin of rescued Armenian women and girls communicate both belongingness and otherness within the communities that they came in contact with? What I mean is that tattoos identify that woman as belonging to the tattooed community that she is absorbed within. And that has not been fully recognized or interrogated. But how did it come to also mean otherness when those Armenian women were reunited with the Armenian community after the war? How did marked skin produce feelings of abjection and shame for tattooed bearing survivors? And how have the tattoos that some women survivors bore as a result of trafficking or absorption come to signify the shame of Islamization and cultural genocide in Armenian post-memory or prosthetic memory? So I have a few images, and the images are largely decontextualized. I hope it's okay. I'm a little camera shy, but I do want to kind of go back and look at this with you if you don't mind. This is a completely decontextualized photograph that I've been analyzing. I've had some input from Melanie actually on this, these photographs that I've been looking at from the Getty archive collection. A photographer whose name was obliterated through the archiving process came to Aleppo in August 1919, and he took 3 photographs in the YWCA in Aleppo. These girls are all tattooed, although it's from the emulsion process, you can't see the tattoos on all of them. And the image is really of rescued girls who are being recuperated by the YWCA. But one of the struggles is really, how would you even begin to identify these girls, to know their stories? And, it's very difficult because, we need surrogates for that. And I would say that I've been analyzing this particular girl because when I published the book and it started to be advertised, the family of this girl here reached out to me. So I have a name. Her name's Marian Azarian of Sivas. But how did that happen? Through memory, right? It wasn't archived. And so I think there's a lot to say about the archival process and the type of violence that happens in the accessioning that has made it so it's really difficult to even know the context to these photos. Perhaps the most intact narrative of a tattooed Armenian woman that I came across is the archived testimony of Aravni Kabakian, who archived 4 hours of testimony at the Zorian Institute in Toronto, which turns out to have the largest oral history archive for the Armenian Genocide, period. And Aravni's story is very interesting. So if you bear with me, I'd like to share some details of it. Well, first of all, she's from Adapazar, and her and her grandmother and father were deported from Adapazar. And somewhere around Urfa, I believe, her grandmother died. And so she and her little sister were alone. She was about 8 years old and her little sister was about 3. So they were very young. And if you can imagine, they walked from Adapazar to Aleppo. That's maybe close to 1,000 kilometers. It's almost incredible to even imagine. When they arrived near Aleppo, her sister was hungry, her baby sister. So she went to find food. And when she came back, her baby sister was gone. She, in her despair, she says, I was an old woman at age 8. She left a written testimony in which she says, I was an old woman at age 8 because of all she had endured taking care of her baby sister as an 8-year-old. She flung herself on the ground with other bodies and resigned herself to die. However, a man whose identity changes according to which testimony you access, he came up to kind of loot her body, and he found a pendant for Saint Guyane pinned to her. And it's not just a pendant, because in the oral testimony, it's a relic. She had a relic. It was a cross with a little glass vial inside with a tiny sliver of bone from an Armenian saint. When he sees this and starts touching her body, she wakes up and he thinks she's come back to life from the dead. So he takes her to his tent in Al-Bab. It's there that things actually, life becomes, she's rescued by a miracle, but it's also, and by a relic, but it's also really complicated because in the tent, she's abused by the children. She's beaten regularly. She says she tries to spend as much time out in the field as she can. And ultimately, she's raped, but she does not use the term rape to describe what happened. It was very difficult to fully discern that in the video. So I realized I actually have an error in my book as a result, because I had watched the video once and then I watched it a few more times recently, and I realized, oh no, I didn't really pick up on the fact that she was both raped and tattooed. And so the two events kind of converge on each other in a way that I think discursively fit what has happened inside the Armenian community, in the sense that tattoos are now synonymous with sexual trafficking, synonymous with sexual violence. And yet in her own testimony, they're combined, because she is raped and then soon after tattooed. And then she she said, sold to an Arab family in Aleppo. And this is where her narrative changes. She's treated incredibly well by the Arab family in Aleppo. She notes that the grandmother bathed her, clothed her, and had her sleep at night with her like a child. And she slept on the bosom of the grandmother on the first night. And so in one survivor story, we get a range of experiences. We get the arduous journey. We get the sexual violence. We get the tattooing, which she describes in detail in her written account, which is archived in Boston. And she doesn't understand why she's being tattooed, but she's being held down on the ground as it happens, which simulates the sexual violence of the rape. And then ultimately, she's absorbed into an Arab family who actually hands her over to the Armenians when King Faisal writes his edict demanding that the Arabs release the Armenian community. He publishes it in the newspaper. So all the Arab community knows they are to release these Armenians held in homes. And ultimately, she is so ashamed of her tattoos that when she becomes a nursing student in Constantinople, Istanbul, she doesn't feel like she can integrate even among the other students and company. She's also working under Mabel Elliott. Maybe Elliott has really negative views of tattoos. She views them as slave brandings. And so she's under a lot of, psychological pressure to remove her tattoos. Ultimately, a doctor from New York City, William Post, who was the head of the Near East Relief Mission, removes her tattoos. And he does it in a very rudimentary way. She's desperate and he gives her what she wants. But it's clear from this video interaction, her scars are very deep on her face, to the degree that they actually appear in her immigration record. Her scars are noted as an aspect of her physical appearance in her immigration record. And there's a lot to say, but I think one of this quote, she has a few really important lines. And one of them was, I was one of those little Armenian girls with rosy cheeks who had carved on her forehead the entire tragedy of her race. And that image of having carved your fate or your past on your forehead really recalls the Armenian term jagadakir, in which your fate is inscribed on your forehead. So this is one small detail was that she did find Shakeh, her sister, her little sister, but she was married to a Muslim, was an Islamized Armenian in Aleppo. By that time had had 8 children, and it's a short-lived reunion. And it's a remarkable reunion because Shakeh's daughter went to school in Damascus, and Aram, who's pictured here, was the school nurse. And her niece identified her and said, "You look like my aunt. You look like my aunt." So she calls it the voice of the blood. It's like the blood was calling out and it's very affective. You know, the niece somehow knew the voice of the blood and listened to it and actually facilitated this reunion so that she could discover that her sister was alive. But it's clear to her sister isn't quite alive. There's a kind of a certified social death has taken place in the sense that her sister can never be Armenian again. She's birthed 8 Muslim children. She's married to a Muslim man. She is now, lost forever. One more decontextualized photograph. I mean, I gave you a lot of context about Aravni, but I can't do that for every snippet or every remnant. And here is an image of a woman who's had tattoo removal surgery in Aleppo. A lot of the tattoo removal surgeries happened here in the United States and in the West, but actually they were performing surgeries in Constantinople, like in the case of Aravni. And here is the case from Aleppo where it's rudimentary in the sense that they're actually carving out the skin. And just to let you know, they make some great strides in a very short period of time to use various kinds of acids. I document an Armenian Armenian text in which Armenian physicians are talking about carbonic acid for the removal of tattoos. And this is, although it sounds severe, it's a series of peels, 7 sessions, 8 sessions to remove the tattoos, much more mild, facial, if you will, than this method. But women were so desperate to remove them that they would prefer the scars to the actual tattoos. And this is my last example for the skin section, which is the fuller context to my book cover. And Lutfi Semerdjian is an Aintab Armenian who, in this text from the League of Nations, and I know some of you have seen this kind of documentation before, she is first, in the possession of a Chechen, sold to a Kurd, and then ends up with a rich Turk named Mahmud Pasha in Baranshahir. And so these documents give us some traces of a survivor's life, what they endured, here trafficked between 3 different men. She's only 17. She either escapes or, is released in 1926. But there's also some aspects of the story. I mean, she lost her family before she was, captured and then underwent this ordeal. But there was something about her portrait to me that was troubling, I think, the dominant narrative, because, I'll start with the premise that you can push back, but I don't see a woman who seems particularly ashamed or camera shy. I mean, she's standing very, again, these are poses, recognizing that, but there was something about the way she was dressed. Also, a lot of Armenians who arrived in Karen Yapey's home didn't have much clothing left. They were in shredded clothing, little tufts of clothing, but she's really well dressed. You can tell that she was in an elite household. I mean, look at this rooster buckle, the carved rooster buckle, and also the details of the clothing, the embroidery. And also I thought, she may have had actually a hand in the making of her clothes, as many women did in that period. Maybe she made them herself. It made me think a lot about the designs vis-a-vis her face. So my press did choose to zoom in on her face, but I think the larger context is offering some information that I thought, could tell us, maybe we should be using some more interdisciplinary methods in order to glean information from stories like this. So the facial tattoos in particular, there are a few things. I have my artist, Daniel Forbes, who I work with. He drew this motif here, which is running down her neck. And a lot of these motifs are vegetative motifs. This is the budai or the wheat motif, and it's definitely a fertility symbol for reproductive health and often applied at puberty. But on the facial motifs here, I consulted Alberto Savioli. He's written the only dissertation about tattoo that has a chapter on tattoos about Deir Zor and their surrounding area. He's actually probably the world's expert on this subject, but his dissertation's in Italian and really needs to be published in English. I consulted him and Don Chatti, both of them anthropologists who worked in Deir Zor, and talked about the motifs with them. And so the triple dot, the dot on the nose and the line on the lower lip actually tells another dimension to the story. The tattoos were actually applied by the Anaza tribe in the Deir Zor area. And so I guess what I'm trying to introduce here is how the tattoos can form yet another layer of inscription that we can use to try to decipher some aspects of the life. And maybe it's not so satisfying, but to me it was satisfying in some part to know that there were pieces of this woman's life that I could glean from the photograph. And then finally, I would offer that the dots on the cheek are actually replicated in the design of the clothing. And that brings me back to my first point is, well, how should we interpret this photograph? And at what point did shame set in or feeling of alienation? Is it something that happens later at the process of like being reabsorbed into the Armenian community? These photographs were taken in Karen Yapé's studio at the rescue home. Upon rescue, like they took these photographs when they rescued women and children in order to document them in their actual state when they arrived. So my third part is bones, and there are a lot of visual examples here, but I know when we talk about memorial for the Armenian Genocide, we think of Tzitzaner Kabert and the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan. And, here is an example of that. And it's also, I would say it's been kind of emblazoned in some prosthetic memory in the United States too, because people remember Kim Kardashian going there for the centennial, right? And here it is also an embodied activity as we think about like, is it 3 kilometers or 4 to get up to, to the site, to march up or walk uphill to the site. So it's arduous in its own way with the eternal flame. So this is an official state memory, or what Pierre Nora would call a site of memory, right? It's a state holiday since 1988, April 24th commemoration. Well, what happens when there is no site? That's what I've been working with on the last part of the book, and how it is that embodiment becomes part of that memorialization process. So I was interviewing people about their experiences in Deir Zor, and this is when Suzanne Khardalian dropped a real gem. When I asked her, like, how did you find your way around Deir Zor? And she said, every Armenian carries a map inside them. And I said, that is just too beautiful. I have to quote that. And so it's like, how do you navigate? And I talk about how Armenians feel their way through the desert, through this unmarked territory. And I know there was an Armenian memorial there, and I will talk about it. But so much was unmarked, so much was unknown. A lot of it relied on, local interpreters, local Deri Arabs from Deir Zor who actually assisted Armenians in these spaces. But I was also interested in how Armenians cope with that psychic pressure to memorialize. I mean, this is a human urge, right? And so I conceptualized Deir Zor as a non-site of memory, which is not my term. I'm borrowing it from Roma Sendaika, a Holocaust scholar. And she talks about unmarked sites of the Holocaust in places like Poland, where people visit and feel unwell. Pardon my German here, but it's like unheimlich, like feeling unwell, uneasy, because you're going into a place and you don't know, people in Deir Zor who visit there. It was actually Khardalian describes that, I didn't know if I was stepping on someone's head when I'm walking on the terrain. That's the kind of experience of the uncanny that we're talking about here. And so haunted spaces, if we want to think of them that way, places that are unmarked can promote those kinds of feelings. In another article I wrote called Phantom Limbs, I talked about people's experiences in those unmarked spaces that actually produced illness. So bone memory is what I'm offering up as an idea of a kind of a practice of ceremonializing the bones, collecting bones, but also imagining the broader Armenian community, including the resurrected deceased Armenians on the plain, on the killing fields, if you will. You can see this in Armenian writings. I've only scratched the surface. I know there are doctoral students here. Someone needs to go through all the literature. There's a lot in which Armenians go to places like Deir Zor and are all of a sudden taken back to 1915 and can see the caravans marching in the desert. And so this is not scientific. You can't explain these phenomena except by thinking about a mediated memory that happens with prosthetic memory, in which Armenians have heard stories from grandparents, have read articles in literature, seen films, and it becomes absorbed as if it were first-person memory. It is first-person memory for these people. And so let me show you some examples of what I'm talking about. And again, this is our terrain, where we have Deir Zor, which people are familiar with. Outside of Deir Zor is a mass grave in El Busaira, where about 15 people I interviewed for this book, people went to also El Busaira, where there are a lot of known bones, but no marker. The bones are actually at a schoolhouse in El Busaira. And then Margada, which had a chapel, but no, it was really just a stop for pilgrims. That chapel was built in 1990. And near Margada are also bones. Estimated about 100,000 Armenians died just right here in this area. And then Al-Shaddade, which is where the caves are located, which Robert Fisk described as primitive gas chambers, if you remember his writing on the subject, where Armenians were thrown and murdered. So let me show you some examples of some very early Armenian writing. I have to go back to Marian again, only because his archive contains many riches. And among them was a letter from him to his relative in the United States named Mirak. And he corresponded frequently with Mirak. And here he says, he's trying to describe being in Deir Zor. He's rescuing live Armenians. But then he adds this: I'm sending fragments of Armenians from here to Cilicia. He's already collecting bones to send to Cilicia, to basically the Catholicosate of Sis. And then this is from 1919, before it was moved. And then he says, I'm sending you a sample or namush inside this letter that shows the Turkish monster's crimes. These are his words. So what is he sending? He's got the letter and he's sending bones inside the letter to his relative in the United States. And this is where we have the first kind of documentation I was able to find of this bone collecting practice, which of course harkens back to relics. Some Armenians use the term relics to describe, these practices. But here we have him exchanging the bones, and this becomes a kind of process. But I'm trying to trace it very early on. 1919 is very early to be looking at this, I think. But I'm sure there are many more riches out there for a young investigator to look at. A second fragment was actually Janik Yaranosian. He was from the Armenian community of Deir Zor. This community stayed on after the deportations. They're the remnants of the deportees who stayed on and had their own community. They had their own church, sort of paripsame there. And he describes that in 1928, he remembers that as a young child, around 8 years old, he and the community knew there was a mass grave 10 kilometers from Deir Zor. They hired a lorry and they went and collected bones as a community. He says somewhere in Deir Zor, there's a photo of me holding 2 bones in my hands, my little hands. He said, even I chipped in to collect the bones. And they brought them to Deir Zor and they created a memorial on the bank of the Euphrates. However, what he says is that a few years later, an Arab farmer tilled the land and all the bones just scattered to the winds. So the memorial was short-lived. But it is an early piece of evidence of the Armenian community's attempt to create a memorial. And this is stored in the Shoah Foundation archives, the visual history archives at the Shoah Foundation. And then we have, this is from 1929, Hamastek's, Kangama head, or with a skull, a wonderful essay in which he documents his journey to Deir Zor. There he collects a skull. So we have Minas Minassian's drawing, which becomes the frontispiece. Becomes the frontispiece for the essay. And I would just say that Hamas Doug does something really interesting because, he ruminates. There's a repeating line, if only I knew the name of that skull. If only I knew the name of that skull. So an obsession with the identity, so the unknown identity of the unmarked bones, of the unaddressed bones, unnamed bones. And then he gives the bones a personality. He gives them a profile. And so all three examples are men of the cloth, holy men. And then all of a sudden, like the skull becomes a chalice at the Eucharist. It's very symbolic. And I forgot to mention, I realized that Rupan Herian does something very similar with the bones he sends his cousin in America, Mirak. He actually offers the samples of bones and 3 profiles of women who the bones might have belonged to. And he imagines them marching through the desert. So there's a common motif, maybe even unconsciously, to name the bones, to give them an identity that's missing as they're anonymized in these mass graves. Finally, this is like one of the kind of going to give you one more example, and then I'm going to talk about the memorial that's now destroyed in Deir Zor for a moment. But this is Haratun Hovakimian, and he was actually a member of the Vorpa Havak. He actually helped collect orphans and widows after the war. He was from Hajin. And he's commissioned by the Catholicosate of Sis to go and collect bones of known martyrs so that there would be an identity. And the martyrs that were selected by the Catholicosate of Sis were Krikor Zohrab and Varkes Sirangulian. Both of them were members of the Ottoman Parliament who were murdered at the Karaköprü in Urfa. It's documented. So he knew where to go. So he, with Kurdish allies, he tries to get inside to Urfa to collect those bones, but they're guarded by gendarme. He can't get to the bones. So he turns back to Deir Zor to try to find, thank you. I'm going to take a break for a second. He goes to Deir Zor and he's able to, through local Armenian interlocutors, find some bones of a priest from Marash. But then he excavates actually some sites. He's not an archaeologist, but he excavates these bones. This, according to the archives, is the Deir Zor Bridge area where a number of Armenian orphans perished. And this becomes a kind of iconic photograph in Armenian prosthetic memory. And there's kind of a witnessing power to it, the way that Hovakimian here is looking at you and it's triangulated. You're to look at him, but also the bones are being gestured to. How you are to interpret this photograph is through this powerful witnessing. And there are other photographs taken this day, but this is the most widely circulated. And I think that means something. And he has an unpublished memoir manuscript at the National Archives in Yerevan. I've heard that maybe it will be published in Armenian sometime, but it details his journey and how he was commissioned by the Catholicos of Sis, and the bones that he excavated with his team, and his team were like the doorman at the hotel. Like, this is not a scientific endeavor, but those bones were about 30 boxes, were shipped to Antelias, Lebanon, and became this ossuary, which is now in the Catholicosate of Sis. And so it's been there since the 1930s. But then there's this long leap to, well, what do we do with Deir Zor? And it was really through the Archbishop of Aleppo, Suran Kataroyan, who actually had the vision of creating monuments in Deir Zor. And this monument is created in 1990, and it is the Martyrs Church and Armenian Genocide Museum. And among the museum in the basement area was an ossuary with bones, of course, with a khachkar, with a gravestone, a simulation of a gravestone, and with vials of earth that you would sprinkle over the dead. And here we have Akhtamar, Van, Ani, and the names of Armenian ancestral homelands symbolically covering the dead. This has been beautifully archived by Peter Balakian in his updated version of Black Dog of Fate, in which he talks about going to Deir Zor. It's so important because when I interviewed Balakian for the book, I told him, your work, it's not creative writing. You've actually documented so much that's not there anymore. Because if you know, in 2014, the church was destroyed when Islamic State took over the region. And when Islamic State took over the region, the only memorial really in the whole area was destroyed. And the site at Margada, which is the chapel at Margada, also built in 1990, is gone. So there's nothing again. But then again, I leave the reader by thinking about what I call bone on bone, which is where we are now. And so this is where, I know it's a dark topic on a very sunny day, but I just want to say that I wanted to leave the reader with ideas about solidarity. I mean, my job here was, in my view, to document thinking about the Armenian genocide, but so much has happened in Eastern Syria since 1915. I can't ignore that. And so here's one of my friends and interlocutors who I interviewed for the book, Saad Assad, and he did not survive the war. He was what you would call an Islamized Armenian inside Syria. He introduced himself first and foremost as an Aintabli, as a person of Aintab. His grandmother was one of the deportees among girls who were gathered at a point who were destined for those caves in Shaddade. And she was taken into his household, and he was very proud of that experience. And he guided many Armenians into these caves. Here, he's guiding us to the caves of Shaddade, and was having trouble finding his way because he was going blind from diabetes. But we found a soldier that day, and the soldier, interestingly enough, said, "You're not supposed to be here." And we said, "We're looking for the caves." And he said, "Oh, they're there." So he actually knew where they were. So what it told me was that it was local knowledge at that point. It wasn't just Saad's knowledge. But he was a proud member of the Jabur tribe. He was a notable figure in the tribe. And I think about him and other tribesmen who resisted Islamic State when they invaded and conquered the region. They died in the hundreds. And that's another untold story, is how the Sunni tribesmen who refused to submit to Islamic State died in the hundreds and have not been remembered by any of us, for sure, right? So I was thinking about what should happen at war's end, tracking that information, and I was interviewing Peter Balakian, and he gave me these beautiful words to think about, because I said, the Armenian monument has been destroyed now for 2 years, because this interview was in 2016, after he had received the Pulitzer. And then I said, what should happen at war's end? And this is what he said. It would be important for the Armenian monuments to be remade. This is an historical ground with large ethical significance for the world, not just for Armenians. A small part of Deir Zor could become a kind of peace park if there were the right kind of leadership involved, and a place where human rights atrocities are reckoned with. Historical memory in public spheres matters to all nations, and as the largest graveyard of the Armenian genocide, Deir Zor is tragic and morally important place in space. And so I want to leave you with that, because I feel like he kind of captured at least the kind of discussion I hope that Syrian Armenians can have about what should happen at war's end. There has been an effort to rebuild the church in Deir Zor. A delegation 2 years ago from Aleppo took a car from Aleppo to Deir Zor, and the car was clearly marked that it was from the prelacy of Aleppo. It was marked in Arabic, and the car was gunned down, and everyone in it died. They were going to Deir Zor to rebuild the monument, but it is still contested territory. And I just want to suggest that, I hope that there can be some solidarity work to think about what should happen at war's end, that whatever is remembered there, much has happened beyond the Armenian genocide for us to remember. So thank you very much, and I'd be glad to take your questions. Any questions? Yes.
That is stunning. From beginning to end, it's the most amazing sort of. What I like is the way in which you take on the layered meanings and very carefully, sort of simultaneously draw them up. And that is how you sort of populate the story, which is, your stories, which is amazing. And as you were talking, I was reminded myself of my own memories. When I went, I initially invited in 2006 both Richard Ovanesyan and Peter Balakian to come with me to Western Armenia that summer, because I went there for 5 summers. Peter Balakian said he was too scared and he couldn't
Come
come.
on. Yeah.
But Richard Ovanesyan said, I'm coming even though I'm shaking in my boots. And when he came, he wanted to look at that. We had to drive through that caravan route. We had to look at that hill when they put down all the Armenians. I mean, so in a way,
Yeah.
he was reliving those sites. And then there was in a huge lake that was where about 30,000 Armenians had been killed. And there was a monastery, that had been submerged in water that came up. When we went there, I sort of, swam to the monastery, but they, the 2 of them, Bartida and Richard, just stayed and prayed for all the victims. It was a very interesting way of sort of seeing the past. So what I would also recommend in terms of what to do is to have these travels, like Carol, I think, talks about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's another way of experience. How can we bring the experiencing of the past together, I think, jointly across Turks and Armenians, probably, is the way to go, and Arabs, of course.
Definitely. Yes. Carol Bertram's book, House in the Homeland, is really important for this too. Documenting Armenian journeys, pilgrimages to the homeland. That's great. Yeah. I do hope that more people will talk about, and I know that this exists in Turkish, but, Turkish and Kurdish experiences in these places. We also have some important anthropologies like Zeren Bener has her work on Mardin, and these kind of hauntings of people who live in the former homes of Armenians and Assyrian populations that were erased in Mardin. So,
and Navarro is a similar book on Cyprus.
Make-believe space.
Confiscated Greek lands, Greek houses, and how they process that.
Yes. These are her students, I think, that have produced these other works of anthropology, kind of applying. So Make-Believe Space by Yael Navarro, and is now, we've got these really interesting anthropologies that are looking at these affects of genocide that are being experienced by the, outside of the survivor community. So it's a great trend. I want to see more of it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for a really interesting talk. I was just curious if you could speak more about how Armenian generations after the genocide have or haven't talked about the tattoos. Because I know that in grandma tattoos, Suzanne Ardalian kind of makes a claim that no one ever speaks of them, and that it's kind of like a lot of dogs and bring them up that part of the code. But I've also seen them used as kind of like a suspect slur against Armenians by other Armenians.
How?
In the sense of someone betraying the nation.
Wow.
Yeah, of being a race traitor, basically. As used against women.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk about what is the discourse now as a kind of postman around tattoos.
Yeah. I would say, I think the Armenian community, I'm hoping that this can, first of all, Suzanne Khardalian generated a conversation, but I think we have to continue it and deepen it. And that's what I'm hearing in your question, is that, our community has walked away with certain assumptions of the tattoo. But I'll tell you, this is my challenge. Find Armenian writers who are condemning women with tattoos in the 1920s. That's my challenge. Find that. Because I couldn't find it. They'll make reference, but they're also marrying these women. These women are getting married. We have documentation of their marriage. They're not ostracized. The Archbishop in Baghdad actually created, even for women who weren't tattooed, even if they were prostitutes, they had a rehabilitation house for them in Baghdad. So some of these leaders, they were interested in recovering everyone. this was the primary mission, and the tattoos seem to be an afterthought in that period. But I'm laying this down, and I hope someone will continue the work. But I did not personally find anything except for that article in an Armenian journal looking at the tattoos, like sharing techniques of tattoo removal. But there are references to tattooed women, but they're stigmatized in other spaces. But a lot of it seems, I do wonder whether Armenians have absorbed more of the European understanding of what these tattoos mean, because there's a lot of slippage between sexual violence and tattoo, and a lot of slippage between prostitution and tattoos. And it's that second aspect, prostitution and tattoos, that for me is a red flag, because it harkens back to 19th century Victorian sociology and understanding of tattoos as marks of deviancy and marks of miscegenation. And so I do go after this in part of the book, because I think that there's something about the thinking about body studies and the liminality of the body, and how humanitarians were framing Armenians as white victims of Turkish atrocities. The tattoos interrupt like the easiness of that narrative. They need to be addressed. So they're, addressed as really marks of miscegenation, acculturation that need to be addressed. And that's why I think the urgency for tattoo removal really appears when people arrive in the United States. Even at the University of Michigan, there was a case of a woman who was engaged. She came to University of Michigan Hospital with her fiance to have her tattoos removed so that she could get married and be free of mind. And so tracing where this idea that the tattoos, are some kind of betrayal or shame, I think are important. And I think about Sarah Ahmed and her remark that the term shame comes from the Indo-European, to turn away. So when women have these tattoos and they're walking through the street, what are they seeing? How are people interacting with them? At what point does the woman, Lutfia, on my cover of my book, when does she feel that people are turning away from her? Is that when shame sets in? I'm trying to think about it. And I realize that this is just one attempt, one stab at it, so to speak. Maybe more can flesh it out more in my puns. Yes. Yeah, anyone else? Catherine, and then was your hand up? No?
So, yeah, thank you so much for, what you presented for us. I mean, really very, very touching, but also importantly, filling in so many of these erasures that your work is doing. And it was hard to hear about this remembering and the ways in which, viscerally, right, in so many ways that what has been lost definitely is reimagined, but also really reenacted in people's lives. But I was struck by two things. First of all, in the bone memory aspect, the conflation or the intermeshing definitely that you yourself point out around the Christian relic, the bone as the relic of the saint, right? And that woman
Abakian, yeah.
And then in the different ways, and it seems there, I'm just trying to think about the processes of Minassian, for instance, in 1938, unearthing these skulls. It is a witnessing, but it was evidence. I mean, at that moment in time, too, the role that these bones were also playing was precisely what you are trying to do by bringing in, evidence of the genocide. And then it seems like there was a transformation in the use of these bones, right? The drawing of it then into different commemorative spaces, in which they're also used with sacred spaces of the priests in the cathedral, right? So I wondered if you could tell us more, because I was curious about these process of memory making, what you said, feeling like this the visceral way that they're supposed to be, or the remnants of bones.
there seem to be also different, let's say, temporal phases in which that memory making is happening, and so that help us also understand the relationship, better the relationship between, actors, witnesses, and evidence itself.
Oof. There's so much in there. I'm taking notes as you're speaking. Temporalities and thinking about what you were saying about evidence. I think, Armenians have an abundance of evidence. I mean, I think the evidence is there, and, our historians, Ron Sunny and Mugar and so many others have proven definitively over and over again. But I think in 1938, I think there was this idea that the bones were empirical evidence of the crime. But I guess in this work, I'm trying to, it's not like I can move away from evidence, because if you're studying genocide, you need some level of empiricism. But I'm also trying to be self-critical about the limits of empiricism, because empiricism has been used, and it was the mode of investigation, and it still wasn't enough, right? So like how can we introduce affect, emotion, materiality, and also the idea with bone memory was actually pushing agency onto the survivor community rather than continually genuflecting before the Ottoman archive. And I realize there's Ottomanists here who rely on the Ottoman, I'm sorry, Gottfried. But the truth is, I mean, we have used the Ottoman archives, but there are limits to what we can do with this topic, with that particular, the perpetrator archive, as I call it. And so how can we think about evidence more critically to include all of these various modes that, well, of course, I think a lot of feminists and a lot of other disciplines are open to thinking about affect and memory, and really giving agency to the survivor community and what they're doing to make sense out of the remains, the human remains. And for me, it is empowering, because each individual who goes there in the absence of a state ceremony, there are ceremonies, there's prayer in the morning, and there are some visitations to the museum that used to take place. But a lot of it was also people designing their own tours, or they're designing their own rituals. Some took bones, some did not take bones. The bones are called, masunkner, they're called relics. And some people chose not to take them. They felt it wasn't their place. So I document that as well, in order to, really give agency to the survivors and how they've created rituals in the absence of really a state acknowledgement, because Syria did not partake in any of this kind of state recognition. They allowed it to happen, but the monuments themselves were created outside of the state frame.
That's what's so interesting about it.
Yeah, that's why it's messy edges, but I mean, I really wanted the book to be even messier. It was 30 chapters. It was a scrapbook. I wanted it to be a scrapbook, and I couldn't do it because it had to follow the conventions of academia, but yet reading, we're all bound to those conventions. But to me, what I was reading, it needed to be more of a scrapbook that you could, move through, read the sections you want, look at the pictures and engage them. You didn't have a question. I don't know where to go next. Yes.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. I'm just thinking, you touched on it earlier, but I just felt that maybe if you can just help us more with your own embodiment of as a researcher, your own feelings, your own kind of history. You touched on it a little bit, and how that, in a way, kind of helped you to navigate the archive and those feelings of your interview. So maybe if you can just reflect on that, because sometimes I think Paul writes about how the researcher also brings some sort of knowledge in the archive.
Well, I do think one of the examples, and this is recorded, so hello everyone, and I'm admitting this on on YouTube, and no one will watch this video because their Zoom is so incredibly boring. It really is. If anything, we learned. But I made a mistake in my book, and there were a few things. Like I watched this video, but I don't think I saw the complete video. But I started to think about maybe my own memory slippage might have happened, that I wasn't connecting the dots with the story of Aghavni Kabakian and her tattooing and her rape. She doesn't call it rape. A man comes in with a stick. Next thing you know, she's bloody. But then some minutes later, she's obsessed with saying over and over again, I wasn't menstruating yet. I wasn't menstruating yet. And so like I think there was a slippage there, and it made me think as a researcher, was there something I didn't want to see? And this is a question I'm asking myself. I actually owe another researcher, Ryan Gingeressa, an apology, so I'm going to do it here, because I thought he was maybe wrong in his interpretation of this video, but I think I was wrong, and I know I was wrong, but I'm still trying to figure out what happened there. And so that's part of it, where we're bringing our subjectivity. Was there something that maybe I didn't want to hear? So you have to ask yourself that, especially I think as a woman doing, research on sexual violence. What else? I mean, I do share very small pieces of, I didn't want to make it overwrought, but to share some of my story, to say, well, why am I so interested in Aleppo? It's very self-serving. I mean, this is the community that received my family after the genocide, and, adopted us and took us in, and, allowed my family to survive. So I'm very obsessed with this particular space. And as for archives and silences, I've long been obsessed with questions of gender and power and sexuality in the Ottoman Empire. So for me, it was important to connect the dots to try to understand how this was even possible. This type of slavery, for example, in this period of the Ottoman world, I mean, they were stamping out slavery. So how was there this giant gap here in which this was possible for slavery to resurface in this very ugly way? There were open slave auctions. How was this even possible? So those questions have always obsessed me. And I do think like a feminist subjectivity is what's attracting me to these questions, if I'm answering. But your question is much more like, deep than that. But yes, you can. You decide. You fight amongst each other. I'm gonna.
Well, your book, made it united to the first two chapters, but it's so hard to read when to release it so well. And how I came up with my book, on page 31, you mentioned the story of Rupen Gavur, for the probable experience of sexual violence, and then go on to explain how Armenian scholarship is silent on the subject of male sexual violence in order to spare male survivors further masturbation. And truthfully, we've heard very few stories of this, so your statement makes sense. But if I can be a little provocative here, might there be a double standard or some sort of bias in the field that reports more on women's sexual violence that doesn't dehumanize them, while men's stories could be argued are more protective? No matter how you cut it, you have to be sensitive to the survivors and their legacies, but also it was interesting contrast for us maybe to grapple with it.
I mean, okay, so this is where I'm going to go into that kind of, how the sausage is made, kind of the behind the scenes story, which is that I learned about Rupen in someone's kitchen in Chicago, that, Rupen, what happened to him, and he was horribly assaulted, as a child near Kharport, where the family was from. And so I said, has this been archived? This is so important because I'm looking for these kinds of stories. I can't find them. So even in the League of Nations records, I only found one case that I document in a footnote, I think, of a wife who said her husband was ravished, a clear allusion to sexual assault. But, Rupen Gavurian did something very brave, and he recorded his testimony. And so I tried to treat it delicately. It's a very difficult video to watch. It's also at Zorian Institute, because he's an old man who's narrating how he was working in a barn when, one of the men in the family came in, closed the doors of the barn, grabbed him from a ladder. And, he's wailing in between. Like, it's so I guess I'm not answering your question, because you're saying, is there a bias in the field? There's definitely a bias in how humanitarians are collecting this information, because they are focused on women. very much. It's very feminized. Like the images themselves are very feminized. So I hear your critique, but if there are other methods through which to get these stories, I would appreciate it, because we do need to tell a story. And then we also might learn them through the whispers. That's the thing. It was through the whispers in the family member's kitchen in Chicago that I learned about Rupen. Otherwise, I would have never found him, really, because the archive in Zorian is so vast. You'd have to watch thousands of hours of film. I think it's something like 1,700 hours of film to find Rupen's story. So that's, I don't know if it's satisfying, but there are more stories to tell. And certainly genocide does, in genocide, men's bodies are targeted, including, sexual violence. And this has been documented in other contexts, much more than our own, because the Armenian community is patriarchal, and Armenian community is also very protective of men's honor. I think that has a lot to do with it. Yes, is it Ani?
No, Anahit.
Anahit.
So in the light of this question, I would like to ask about the challenges of ethical consideration of the topic, especially when we talk about sexual connections and rape and tattoos. But what is the willingness of victims to talk about this kind of sensible topics? And as you mentioned, there were also momentums when you, even in your research, in your book, you faced like gaps of misunderstandings of this levels, or to accurately interpret the situation or the overcome it. Also, that we can take into consideration the moral concepts and patriarchal concepts of female.
Right. Oh, well, let's start with the last part, which is like the mistakes. Mistakes happen. I mean, researchers are not gods. We make mistakes, and I think that's really important for us to step down and say, because for me, that's important. That self-criticism is important to me as a feminist. I have to absorb that. I have to absorb your critique, listen to it carefully, in order to be more carefully engaged politically and academically. So yes, I mean, mistakes happen, hopefully not more than one, And then the second part of your question, which is ethical. So I'm going to go back to Rupen Gavorian's story. I know the family. And so when I wrote that section of the book, I sent it to them. And I said, I listened to his video, and it was just, it was just beyond anything I could have ever thought I would hear. But I need to know that you think I've done justice to his story. I need to know that. So what did I do? I did peer review not in the academic way. I took the peer review to the community member. So here's what I'm going to say. I'm reading outside of my field all the time. And, I recently read, Pollution is Colonialism, which is a really amazing book. This researcher, who's a fish researcher, takes their research back to the community. What would it look like if and I know you're sociologists, probably, so you're like looking at me saying, where have you been? But the truth is, why is... Yeah, pollution is colonialism. She's they are a fish biologist who takes their research back to the community. How can we rethink what peer review, we have peer review for journals, but what I want to take my work back to the community, if I can do more of that, because that's how I think we can be more ethical. But I'm sure with other women's stories, maybe I wasn't as careful, especially Miriam Azarian, the woman whose identity I was able to learn through their family. I didn't know who her family was. I didn't know how to trace her. I had no name, so these are some of the tricks, but I think we can do more of this as academicians if we want to be more ethical. Mm-hmm. I don't know who to call it. So you two decide. Melanie? Melanie?
But Elyse, thank you so much. It's actually really beautiful to hear you present my work. A starting point in sort of saying how beautifully and elegantly you maneuver materiality, memory, tangible and the intangible to create a story that has been heard. You also don't shy away from violence. The first two chapters, maybe one of the book, are incredibly violent, and I think that reminds me of a shift in World War I studies where the violence became visible, and so this later comment now reminded me of sort of ethical consideration that you so beautifully outlined right now. It reminds me of Archival Skin and Archival Kin by Imada, who works on photographs of leopards in Hawaii, and has this beautiful introduction of what is ethical to represent and what is our ethical responsibility as historians to talk to the community in representing. So it's a beautiful connectivity that we just recently talked about in class. But what I would love to hear you talk a little, so I'm setting you up a little bit. But what I would love for you to talk a little bit is coming back to post-memory in the Christian space generally is, and she has this beautiful essay about photographs and specifically family photographs.
Oh, yeah.
Where post-memory, where she actually comes up with this idea of post-memory and how these artifacts live and create a memory that's not your own, but lives inside of you. And I'm wondering, now you are dealing with a different kind of photograph. You're dealing with a photograph, or many of your photographs are created by institutions or organizations. And so, and of course, the very striking photograph of this group of women. And I would like to maybe, if you could talk a little bit more how you could, in your reading of these photographs, how do you connect the personal, the communal, and the institutional, and how, because you're so good at layered reading, and so within these photographs, how do you draw these connections between the personal and and what are your challenges?
Oh my gosh, what a question! Because and I recently we were at a conference with artists, and Marianne Hovhannissian is like drawing attention to how the process of archiving produces all of these erasures, which is even more of a reason why we have to critique how we're engaging and be critical of how we engage the archive. So I mean, it is very frustrating to have these photographs where even the photographer's name is obliterated. And of course, that would be the same for a family photograph. But I think, in short, I think what the beauty of that particular artist's work is that it's inviting us to engage with the photographs, because a kind of crowdsourcing of this material is where we can get to those family stories that give the photographs more meaning, and perhaps reveal identities or contexts, or even the time period in which the photograph was taken. But it's a really difficult question. I think, how do we start to reach the families and the community? I mean, I think that's why I'm excited about what artists are doing, because their exhibition work invites people in to the space, and then it becomes, well, sort of like another layer of peer review, where all of a sudden, if this space is created for family and community to come in, we can, which is actually what the artist has done with her installation, is invite people to help interpret the photographs. It's a radical move. And I think, with these types of, dislocated documents, decontextualized documents, and I know what could be called a mutilated archive. I don't know, we could go on, but what do? The best we can do is try to find a mode of repair. And I think that could be, a way to further contextualize these photographs. I mean, it is, you said about the violence. I mean, there is an image that you yourself have helped me interpret. I chose not to show it today. I wasn't sure whether I should show you the portrait of Marian Azarian or show her fully clothed, because there was a very objectifying image of her. And I feel like if I'm going to show that image, I need to move into much deeper context before I show you that image. I can't just show it to you and say, look at this, and then move on. But that's how it was displayed in Los Angeles. It was just shown. They declared she was a prostitute because she was tattooed, and then they moved on. But none of that is clear. Her image is decontextualized. So yeah, I feel like the ethical work is done perhaps in collaboration with communities. And that's how we can get beyond these very distinct layers of knowledge around the photographs. So I don't know if I did a good job, but that was a great question.